Well, I think on one level, he's mourning the death of the host that he, as a parasite, has infested for years. This is someone who is always in search of a place to commit U.S. military power, money, and capability. So now he's finally found something that we are incapable of mastering, and it's no longer possible to disguise. And so he's essentially dismissing the United States, its armed forces, its people, as unworthy of further support from Robert Kagan. What a great man. Well, I think without a doubt, they certainly have. But I think President Trump probably lives in a bubble of his own making, and people are very reluctant to pull him out of the bubble. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't suspect that, he's hit a concrete reinforced wall that he can't penetrate. I think he probably knows that, but he refuses to convey the impression that he hasn't won this war. I think his problem is, frankly, one of bluff. Most of what he does, if you watch him carefully in foreign policy, but here at home as well, is an exercise in psychological bluff. He wants the outward show of success, and he's managed that to some extent in struggles with weak, inconstant leaders in Europe, and I would argue in Venezuela to a limited extent. But when he employed the bluff against Iran, it failed, and his bluff is being called. He never expected this. This is hard for him to imagine. So that's why I've tried to tell people that Project Freedom was abandoned in favor of a new project called Project Nowhere. His game of power and coercion on behalf of Israel has reached its limits. He's lost the strategic initiative. It's not difficult to understand why, but he never understood what he was up against. He didn't understood the limitations of what he has. One of the things, we've talked about this before, that distinguished Eisenhower from all of his successors is having lived through the Second War and then gotten to know what it took to wage that war. Eisenhower always had a very acute sense of American limitations. He understood that the American people were not interested in, nor would they sustain, a long, brutal war. That was simply an impossibility. He also understood that World War II had effectively tapped us out. And people don't realize that we reached a point where we were running out of manpower to send overseas. So the bottom line is that there was never a sense of limitations with Trump. He felt as though he was the child that broke into the candy store and he could eat as much as he liked and no one would interrupt him. It hasn't worked.
Analysis focuses on a key neoconservative figure publicly acknowledging major strategic losses involving key Middle Eastern players, interpreted as a sign of broader policy exhaustion rather than mere reflection. The exchange highlights contrasts between public optimism and private realizations among leaders. Takeaway: this part reveals how even staunch advocates of interventionist policies are confronting realities of overextension, where sustained military and financial commitments yield diminishing returns. It portrays decision-makers as operating in insulated environments, resistant to acknowledging constraints rooted in historical precedents of resource exhaustion and public war fatigue. The reluctance to project weakness perpetuates cycles of escalation, underscoring the gap between rhetorical strength and operational limits. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for predicting future policy shifts, as illusions of unlimited capability clash with tangible boundaries. Subscribe to World Talk Recap for more insightful breakdowns like this. What hidden realizations are shaping high-level decisions right now?
And when it comes to Kane, we've discussed that before. He was not appointed and made a 4-star to say no. And he's an airman. And I think, like most airmen, he was more than willing to give it a go because they thought this might be another opportunity to win a war with air power only. Of course, that's nonsense, as we both know. But nevertheless, I'm very skeptical of these attempts to sort of retrospectively confer a degree of credibility and character on these people when I didn't see much evidence for it to begin with. I think it's worth pointing out that right now, behind the scenes, at least I'm being told this, that the argument is that President Trump was misled by his quote-unquote Israeli friends. and that had he paid more attention to his American advisors, the narrative goes, then events might have taken a different course. But the truth is, there's a mountain of evidence that, like President Lyndon Johnson, Trump and his inner circle, including Vance, were really driving military action and escalation from the beginning. And Trump seems to have rejected advice from anyone in or out of uniform who opposed it. But very few people that opposed what he wanted to do ever got to the White House, if any. And I think that's your point on the bubble.
Yeah. The conversation examines an inner circle dominated by agreeable voices, with debates over specific officials' enthusiasm for escalation. It contrasts this with a leader's preference for projecting success through psychological tactics rather than grounded strategy. Takeaway: insular advisory groups can amplify risky choices by filtering out dissenting perspectives, creating echo chambers where bold but unfeasible plans thrive. Historical military figures who experienced large-scale conflicts prioritized realistic assessments of endurance and logistics, a mindset seemingly absent in recent approaches. This leads to over-reliance on posturing, which falters against determined adversaries. The analysis warns that prioritizing image over substance risks long-term credibility, while financial incentives tied to conflict can further skew priorities away from domestic needs.
Developed a lot of self-delusion in the 90s. We involved ourselves in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And at one point, we bombed the Serbs in and around Sarajevo and convinced ourselves that this was the dramatic turning point. When in reality, at the time, I was on the ground in Bosnia and I was talking to British and French officers that were involved. And they pointed out to me in great detail that the British and French artillery had done infinitely more damage with greater precision than the airstrikes. So I sort of tucked that away. But if you go back to Holbrooke, who was the ambassador at the time that Clinton had appointed to deal with all of this, he became a huge advocate for the use of air power. That was his sort of favorite topic. Then we get into Kosovo, and it was made very clear to General Clark that he could have whatever he wanted, do whatever he wanted. Obviously not nuclear weapons, but that never ever came up for discussion anyway. But he wasn't going to get any ground force. And so whatever he did, he had to accomplish with air power. Well, he accomplished a great deal, but it wasn't enough. And ultimately, we had to send Strobe Talbot to Moscow and bribe the Russians to abandon their Serb friends, at which point in time, the Serbs realized they weren't going to get any coal or oil or food or medical support of any kind during the winter that was coming. So he said, either I get out now or I'll face a winter and hundreds of thousands of Serbs will die. But it wasn't exclusively by any stretch of imagination because of air power. But the story was spun up to make people believe that air power had been successful. And then when you move on to the Middle East, to Iraq, the Iraqis were many things, but they were never, 10 feet tall, even though people described them that way. And the Iraqis were in no position to resist us for any length of time, and it was never required to bring in a large number of ground forces. Now, the neocons understood that, but they made the fatal mistake of having once gotten there of staying. But again, I think the glossy cover to this sort of narrative of self-delusion is air power über alles. Mm-hmm. And I think Trump fell victim to it. Now everybody's backpedaling and trying to get out from under the problem, but it's not going to work. Everybody who's being part of this, Judge, is ultimately going to go down, I would say, politically for what's happened.
Review of previous interventions in the Balkans and Middle East illustrates repeated overconfidence in aerial operations alone, often requiring additional diplomatic or ground elements for resolution. Narratives of decisive victories are shown as exaggerated for political effect. Takeaway: repeated reliance on technology-driven, low-footprint warfare has fostered dangerous myths about easy dominance, ignoring the need for combined arms, logistics, and political settlements. From European conflicts requiring bribes and winter pressures to regional operations where initial successes masked occupation challenges, these examples demonstrate how selective storytelling sustains flawed doctrines. Current leadership appears caught in similar patterns, leading to backpedaling once realities surface. This highlights the importance of learning from history to avoid repeating costly illusions in complex geopolitical arenas. Subscribe to World Talk Recap to stay ahead with these deep dives. Hit that button now. How do outdated military myths continue to influence today's crises?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer to it except to point out that there are a lot of people who are blaming the Israelis behind closed doors, but they're all afraid to say so publicly. And I think part of that is that they don't want to admit that, the Israelis have led us down the path to destruction eagerly. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke quite recently, just a few hours ago, as I understand it, saying that the war is not over and it must continue. And I think that's what he wants. He doesn't care what it costs us. He doesn't care what it costs the world. He doesn't care how many people starve in the global south. He doesn't care whether or not inflation is going to destroy us, along with large numbers of governments all over the world. It's irrelevant to him. He wants complete dominance, control, hegemony over the Middle East. The only way he can get it is with us. So I think, unfortunately, Trump can't blame it on the Israelis. Whether he likes it or not, he's going to be held responsible. But
focus shifts to potential scapegoating among allies, ongoing demands from one side despite mounting global costs, and rising inflation affecting essentials like food and energy. It connects these to risks of widespread instability and governmental changes. Takeaway: when high-stakes policies falter, internal narratives often deflect responsibility onto external partners. Yet accountability ultimately rests with primary decision-makers. Persistent calls for continued action, indifferent to humanitarian and economic fallout, accelerate problems like supply chain disruptions and price surges. Historical parallels, such as revolutions triggered by basic needs shortages, suggest that sustained pressures could topple administrations worldwide. Disengagement becomes necessary for stability, even if politically difficult, as global interdependence means distant conflicts reshape daily life everywhere. What chain of events could force major realignments in alliances?
Absolutely, without question. Let's look at this for a second, because initially, Russia, China viewed India as a potential strategic partner. But India has been unable to solve its own problems. It's been unable, so to say, to get out of its own way. Iran is very different. And in contrast to us, I think both the Chinese and the Russians viewed the Iranian state, nation, and population as strong enough to resist us. That's one of the reasons that they helped and they assisted, but the Iranians would never allow them to bring in their troops, their forces, their navy, their air force, or anything else. And the Chinese and the Russians also saw Iran at the center of this Central Asian, Eurasian landmass project known as Belt and Road. The idea being that you build this tremendous network of transportation and movement of commercial goods back and forth across the continent, all the way from Europe to Shanghai, from the west coast of Africa all the way to the east coast of China. All of this is now part of the reason for Iran's success and the confidence that now the Chinese and the Russians have in them. So what we're seeing is a reversal of what used to exist. Remember in 1492, when Columbus crossed, he discovered a new world, and very rapidly that discovery powered Europe. How did it power Europe? Mainly through the acquisition of huge quantities of gold. We had a series of empires that rose and fell, but the living standards rose. Our technology developed faster. Well, that's over. And that kind of wealth is now being generated in the place that used to be the dominant creator of wealth in human history, and that's China. China is now the wealth engine. It's the workshop of the world. It's the production center for the world. We're not happy about that, but we've ultimately squandered our wealth pointlessly and needlessly. President Trump is going to go over to China and he's going to play what he thinks are cards. He's going to look at his cards, and there may be baseball cards, but they're of no value in this discussion with the Chinese. And China is weathering this terrible disruption that we've created through this war. They have tremendous stockpiles of everything from oil to coal to various kinds of energy creation. We could go on and on, food, you name it. China is ready to deal with this, and the rest of the world is seeing it. And China has skillfully avoided being involved in any of the disputes that we've started, stayed away from all these wars and conflicts. While with each passing year, we found a new reason to go somewhere in the world, Africa, Latin America, wherever it happens to be, and intervene, to disrupt, to meddle, to push. China has not done that. China is certainly willing to do business with everybody, but China has demonstrated conclusively it's not interested in changing regimes or countries or societies. So this is why you're seeing this tremendous shift in wealth and power. And I don't think we can reverse it. Now, there are ways for us to benefit from it, strangely enough. We can alter our behaviors, and ultimately the world can become more balanced in time. But for the moment, the wealth, the technology is moving east.
The dialogue addresses accelerated cooperation among certain nations in response to recent events, alongside a broader transition of economic and technological momentum toward Asia. It contrasts proactive development models with interventionist habits. Takeaway: external pressures have solidified ties across Eurasia, enhancing collaborative infrastructure and resilience projects that position certain states as central hubs. This reflects a historic reversal where production and innovation centers relocate, fueled by restraint from meddling versus habitual disruptions elsewhere. Stockpiling, business focus, and avoidance of regime change efforts build credibility and attract partners, while squandered resources elsewhere hasten relative decline. Adapting through behavioral changes rather than confrontation offers pathways to a more balanced global order, though reversal seems unlikely. Subscribe to World Talk Recap for unfiltered global insights every week. Where is the next era of innovation and influence truly emerging?
I think, again, in addition to squandering wealth unnecessary on things that are absolutely not profitable to us, instead of reshoring industries, which should have been President Trump's top priority, securing our borders, ending illegal immigration, enforcing the law, all of those things are things that he ran on, but he hasn't done it. Instead, he's done, I think, what Scott Ritter is alluding to. He's wasted the tremendous foundations of power that were built up in 30, 40, 50 years of Cold War. There's no question about it. Now, is it to the point where if we were dragged into a war at this stage with a major power, that we would be at risk of being destroyed? I don't think it's gotten that far, but in time it will. But I think the greater danger is not so much the low stocks of precision-guided missiles and weapons. It's this tendency that we have to create alliances against us. You started off with a critical question. Has this brought Russia, China, and Iran closer together? Absolutely. I would go one step further and say that most of the global South sees itself now aligned with China and Russia against us. And the Europeans that spoke out and warned everybody about this, like Mr. Orban, they're not on the stage right now. And they desperately need to get on the stage, and soon, because they used to be the sober-minded ones. They're the ones that said, what do you want to go to Vietnam for? What are you doing? Well, Desert Storm looks good, but I don't think we really want to be part of it. They were the ones that talked sense to us. They became vassals of this greater sort of neocon fantasy world in which we were going to dominate everybody everywhere all the time. Well, that's crazy nonsense. It's nothing that anybody with a right mind should even strive to achieve. So bottom line is, Judge, I think Scott's right, except that I would go one step further, and I find the second part of that answer far more dangerous, the possibility that people are just aligning against us.
Concerns over depleted stockpiles from multiple support efforts are weighed against the bigger risk of unified opposition forming internationally. Questions arise about prolonged troop presences in specific regions and their strategic relevance. Takeaway: diversion of advanced weaponry to various theaters erodes readiness built over decades, compounding vulnerabilities if larger confrontations arise. More critically, policies risk forging broad coalitions in response, isolating the initiator as even traditional voices of caution are sidelined. Long-standing bases and control arrangements, once justified by Cold War threats, now appear mismatched to current economic interdependencies and local preferences for stability. Shifting focus to internal security and border issues could better preserve foundational strengths than scattered commitments.
Well, as we've discussed before, I don't think he has one. And every time that one might have surfaced in some way, it involved some form of concession from us that was anathema to him. So I think at this stage, whatever he does, whatever decision he makes is going to convey the impression that we have lost strategically in the Persian Gulf. That means that the only other alternative is to go back to attacking Iran in the hopes that maybe this time around you'll hit the right targets, this time around you'll do enough damage, and this time around the Iranian state, society, and people will fall apart. That's not going to happen, Judge. Absolutely will not happen. And in fact, earlier today, a spokesman for the Iranian government stated that if they are brought once again under attack by the United States, they may consider enriching uranium to 90%. In other words, produce the plutonium that is critical to a nuclear weapon. They haven't done it, and I still hear voices telling me that they don't want to. But if they are attacked again, that's something they have to consider. And I think this is the greatest tragedy of all. Obviously, my heart goes out to the hundreds of millions of people around the world that are now going to be desperately hungry because Donald Trump, in his war, has single-handedly reversed the Green Revolution.
Right.
You go back to the 60s, the population was half the size of the population today. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because we were able to produce the Green Revolution, and people could eat on a scale and live on a scale they never have before. Well, he's destroyed that, I think, at least temporarily over the next 12 months or so. He's set inflation loose. But the worst part of all is that he has sent an unmistakable message. If you don't want the United States and or Israel to attack you, you better invest in nuclear weapons.
Speculation on limited exit options leads to discussions of renewed strikes, nuclear threshold risks, and reversal of agricultural gains that once supported global populations. The exchange closes with appreciation for the insights shared. Takeaway: without acceptable compromises, decision loops may default to escalation, inadvertently signaling that only extreme deterrence ensures security. This could spark proliferation while undoing decades of food production advances, threatening hunger for hundreds of millions amid rising costs. The human and systemic costs underscore the tragedy of short-term power plays disrupting fragile global equilibria. Long-term recovery demands prioritizing restraint, domestic renewal, and cooperative frameworks over dominance fantasies. What single choice today might prevent tomorrow's greatest regrets? Subscribe to World Talk Recap and join the conversation in the comments below.